In this session, we are going to discuss the topic of luminescence and emission spectroscopy. In first part of the lecture, we will be first discussing what is luminescence, why it occurs, and what are the different physical concepts involved in it. Later, we'll go through the details of what is electromagnetic radiation, what is electromagnetic spectrum, and then finally, we'll go into emission spectroscopy. Later, we'll be discussing the applications of luminescence and emission spectroscopy at the end of the lecture. So, firstly, let's see what is luminescence. The word luminescence comes from a pair of Latin words, lumen and essentia. Lumen means light and essentia means essence. Coming to the definition of luminescence, the emission of light by a substance that has not been heated is luminescence. Here we have to focus on not being heated. This has been specifically included in the definition because luminescence is categorically different from another phenomena that we observe, which is blackbody radiation, where light radiation is emitted by virtue of a temperature of the object. However, luminescence is different from blackbody radiation, thus not being heated is added in the definition. In general, luminescence is soft glowing light. On the right side, three different examples of luminescence have been provided that we see in real life. The first image corresponds to bioluminescent beach in Karnataka. In the seawater, there are bioluminescent planktons which undergo biochemical reaction releasing light. And at night, the waters glow due to this bioluminescence. And another example is fireflies, which also emit light due to bioluminescence. The third example is the glow sticks that we generally see during concerts. In these sticks, there are chemicals uh, which react and emit light when they are activated. All these three are examples of luminescence. However, the source of luminescence may differ. All of them emit soft glowing light. So, let's see, how does luminescence occur? We all know that electrons revolve around the nucleus in an atom. So let us consider a simplistic atom where an electron is revolving around the nucleus. From the Morse model, we know that there are different energy levels in an atom where the electron can revolve around the nucleus. Here n is the principal quantum number which signifies these different energy levels. And higher the energy level, the farther the electron is from the nucleus. And from the quantum physics, it is known that the energy levels that electron occupies are discrete and not continuous, which are signified by these principal quantum number n equal to 1, n equal to 2, n equal to 3, and so on, as we move away from the nucleus. That has been represented here as two different energy levels, where n equal to nh is some higher energy state and n equal to 1 is a ground state where the electron is initially present. Now, when some energy which is sufficient is provided to the electron absorbs this energy and transitions to higher energy state. The higher energy state that the electron excites to can be determined by the energy difference between the excited state and the ground state and should match the energy provided initially. And since this excited state, which is higher energy state, is unstable, the electron relaxes to ground state, and this same energy difference is emitted by the electron in the form of electromagnetic radiation, which is light. The frequency of the electromagnetic radiation can be obtained using the relation E equal to h nu, where nu is the frequency, h is the Planck's constant, and delta E is the energy difference between the two energy states between which the electron has transitioned. Here, the initial energy provided to the electron can be of different types. However, as the electron relaxes from excited state to ground state, it emits light, which is why it is called luminescence. So, depending on the type of energy provided to the electron initially, there are different types of luminescence. The first kind is photoluminescence, where the source of excitation is light itself. Some of the common examples for this are glow-in-the-dark stickers, where during the daytime these stickers are exposed to ambient light and they absorb this light. During the night, they glow when the lights are switched off. These glow-in-the-dark stickers are example for phosphorescence, which is where the light emission is continuously emitted even after the light source is removed. Whereas other type of photoluminescence is fluorescence, where the light emission immediately ceases in the absence of light source. The fluorescent tube lights that we use in our houses are a good example for the phenomena of fluorescence. In these fluorescent tubes, when the electrical current passes through mercury vapor inside the tube, it produces ultraviolet light. And when this ultraviolet light incidents on the phosphor coating on the inner surface of the tube light, then that phosphor glows, emitting visible light. This is example for fluorescence. Other types of luminescence include thermoluminescence, where heat is the source of excitation. The example for thermoluminescence is a mineral called fluorite. When a small amount of this mineral is heated using a candle in a dark room, it emits light. Other kind of luminescence is bioluminescence, which we have already discussed before, where the bioluminescent plankton undergo biochemical reaction releasing light. Here the source of excitation is biological reaction. Chemiluminescence is another type of luminescence where the source of excitation is the energy released during the chemical reaction. Apart from this, there are other types of luminescence as well. Now that we have discussed luminescence, now let us see what information does the emitted radiation possess. In order to understand and interpret the light radiation that is emitted due to luminescence, we first have to go back to the basics of electromagnetic radiation. The light radiation is nothing but an electromagnetic radiation, which is a form of energy that travels through space in the form of a wave. The wave consists of mutually perpendicularly oscillating electric and magnetic fields, and this wave travels at the speed of light, which is 2.998 into 10 power 8 meter per second. The energy contained in the electromagnetic radiation is given by the relation E equal to h nu, where h is the Planck's constant, whose value is 6.626 into 10 power minus 34 joules second. Nu is the frequency of the light wave, and the frequency can be rewritten as c by lambda, where c is the speed of light and lambda is the wavelength of the light, which is the distance between any two crests or troughs of the wave. Thus, depending on the frequency or wavelength of the electromagnetic radiation, it can be characterized into different types. The different types of electromagnetic radiations are listed out from lower energy to higher energy, where the electromagnetic radiation with longest wavelengths, which are the radio waves, whose wavelengths are all in the order of meters and kilometers, have the lowest energy, and as the wavelength reduces, the energy of the electromagnetic radiation increases. The next comes the microwaves, whose wavelength is in the order of centimeters, And infrared radiation comes next. The visible light, which allows us to see the world, has a wavelength range of nanometers. Next comes the ultraviolet radiation, whose energy is higher than the visible range and has a wavelength between 100 to 400 nanometers. Beyond this, the X-rays are more energetic, whose wavelength is in the order of zero point 0.1 to 10 nanometers, and gamma rays, whose wavelength is very short, which is in the order of picometers. Here, the smaller wavelength corresponds to smaller distance between the successive waves. And and smaller the wavelength, more number of waves will pass through a point in a given second, which means higher energy is transmitted, which is higher frequency and shorter wavelength. This figure shows the scale of different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation in comparison to real-life objects. As explained before, the radio waves have the longest wavelength, which is in the order of meters and kilometers, almost as much as the size of the buildings. The microwaves are little shorter, and infrared has wavelength almost in the range of the size of the tip of a needle. And the visible light has even smaller wavelength, which is almost the similar size as the protozoans, which are around 1 micron. As we go towards even shorter wavelengths, the wavelength of the ultraviolet radiation is almost as the order of the size of the molecules, and the wavelength of X-rays is almost the size of the atom, and the wavelength of the gamma rays is of the order of the atomic nucleus. Here we can see the entire visible spectrum, the visible light, which allows us to see the world, is only present in this small band between 400 to 700 nanometers, in which we have different colors corresponding to different wavelengths of light, where the shorter wavelength is towards the violet and blue color, whereas the longer wavelength in the visible light has red color. Now that we have covered the topics of electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic spectrum, wavelength, and frequency, now let's go to spectroscopy. Spectroscopy is a field of study that measures and interprets electromagnetic spectrum. The study of wavelength dependence of the absorption and emission of light by matter is spectroscopy. The spectra of electromagnetic radiation from an object is measured in order to obtain information about the structure and properties of the matter. The spectroscopy involves the splitting of light beam by a prism or diffraction grating to give off a particular discrete line pattern called spectrum. This spectrum is unique to each element and can be used as its signature to identify its presence. It's like a fingerprint for different elements. This spectrum will be discussed in detail in further slides. White light is nothing but the colorless daylight. It is an electromagnetic radiation which contains all the wavelengths of visible spectrum at equal intensity. Thus, when white light is passed through a dispersive prism, it splits into a continuous spectrum of different wavelengths, as you can see here. The different wavelengths of light inside the white light are refracted and deflected at different angles. This is because the refractive index of the material varies with wavelength of the light. Generally, the longer wavelengths, such as red, undergo smaller deviation than shorter wavelengths. This can be seen here where, as the white light enters the prism, the red in the white light deviates at shallow angles, whereas the shorter wavelengths deviate at steeper angles. Thus, the white light gets split into different colors corresponding to different wavelengths, and it gives this continuous spectrum in the visible range. All the different frequencies or wavelengths are shown in the band in the visible range, where the red is at 700 nanometers and the violet is at 400 nanometers. So far, we have discussed about the continuous spectrum, which is formed due to the splitting of the white light using a prism, resulting in a continuous band of different wavelengths corresponding to different colors. However, there is another type of spectrum called line spectrum, which consists of discrete lines at specific wavelengths separated by dark bands, as shown here. Each of these different lines in the line spectrum corresponds to different energy, different lambda. In the earlier discussions regarding luminescence, we have studied that the electron present at ground state, when it is provided with sufficient energy, the electron transitions to higher energy state. And in the higher energy state, since the electron is unstable, it relaxes to the ground state, resulting in emission of radiation. The energy of this radiation is equal to the energy gap between the different energy levels involved in the electronic transition. Thus, delta E equal to h nu equal to hc by lambda. We know that in different atoms and molecules, the electronic configurations is different. Thus, when energy is provided to different molecules, the electronic transitions involved in these different molecules will be different, because of which the energy levels and the energy difference between those levels involved in those electronic transitions is different. Thus, the energy released when the electrons return back to their original state is also different. Thus, each element produces unique set of spectral lines, which is like fingerprint of that substance. The distinct lines in the spectrum correspond to specific wavelengths corresponding to emitted radiation during different electronic transitions in the material. In complex molecules, multiple electronic transitions may occur between different energy levels, which result in emission of multiple photons at different energies and different wavelengths. Thus, when the electrons in different energy levels, when they return to their original energy state, they release energy in the form of photons at different energy levels, such as E1, E2, and so on, corresponding to different lambda, lambda 1, lambda 2, and so on. Thus, these different photon emissions corresponding to different electronic transitions result in multiple specific bands seen in the line spectrum. Since the emission is happening in only these specific wavelengths, the rest of the wavelengths in which the emissions are not happening appear black in the spectrum. Thus, it is known as line spectrum. Also, the energy levels in different atoms are discrete and quantized, and the emitted photons correspond to different electronic transitions, resulting in discrete wavelengths corresponding to discrete energy levels, and thus discrete lines in the line spectrum, as explained before. Now, to understand the line emission spectrum better, let's take an example of hydrogen emission spectrum. The hydrogen emission spectrum can be obtained using hydrogen gas lamp, as shown here, where hydrogen gas is filled inside a lamp and electrical energy is provided to this hydrogen gas lamp in the form of electrical current. When this electrical current is passed through the hydrogen gas, the hydrogen atoms absorb this energy and gets excited, thus causing the electrons inside the hydrogen atoms to jump into higher energy levels. Now, since the higher energy levels are not stable, the electrons tend to return to lower energy levels and they release energy in the form of photons as they transition to lower energy levels. Thus, the light emitted from the hydrogen gas lamp contains different wavelengths corresponding to different electronic transitions during the excitation and relaxation of electrons. Now, using a prism, we can split different wavelengths inside this emitted light, and similar to the process that we have already seen while obtaining the continuous spectrum, the longer wavelengths deflect at shallower angles, whereas the shorter wavelengths deflect at steeper angles. And these discrete individual wavelengths contained in the emitted light of hydrogen gas lamp forms discrete lines on the hydrogen emission spectrum. Since the emitted light from the hydrogen lamp doesn't contain the wavelengths in between these discrete lines, the line spectrum of the hydrogen shows dark bands or dark spaces in between these specific lines. Thus, the emitted light from the hydrogen gas lamp produces a specific line spectrum consisting of distinct wavelengths corresponding to the energy transitions of the hydrogen atom. Now, let us see how the different energy levels are present in a hydrogen atom. Based on quantum mechanics principles, the electrons in an atom can only occupy specific energy levels which are discrete and quantized. That means the electrons are not allowed to possess continuous energies, but they can only possess discrete energies. And these discrete energy levels can be obtained using Bohr's model. And here in this relation, m is the mass of electron, E is the charge of the electron, and n is the principal quantum number, which refers to the different quantized energies. Here, as we can see, the different energy levels in a hydrogen atom, where as the principal quantum number value increases, we move away from the center. Now, let's see the different electronic transitions that occur in a hydrogen atom when energy is supplied to it. As we can see here, the hydrogen atom contains only one electron, and that one electron occupies the ground state, which is n equal to 1 energy level when it is not excited. However, when the energy is supplied to it, this electron can get excited to higher energy levels, which is n equal to 2, 3 or 4 or so on, depending on the energy supplied to it. Once the electron gets excited to higher energy levels, it loses energy in the form of light and transitions back to lower energy levels. Here, the hydrogen emission spectrum shows four wavelengths corresponding to the hydrogen emission in the visible range. From these four wavelength values, we'll try to estimate what are the different energy levels corresponding to these four line spectra. Using this equation of this energy difference between two energy levels involved in an electronic transition to be equal to the energy of the emitted light, which is equal to hc by lambda. So first we'll try to see what is the energy corresponding to the wavelength of 656 nanometer. Using this 656 nanometer, here we can obtain the combination of N1 and N2 corresponding to the two energy levels involved in the electronic transition corresponding to this specific wavelength emission. Thus, when the energy is supplied to the electron, when the electron transitions to n equal to 3 and then when it relaxes to n equal to 2, that corresponds to this specific wavelength of 656 nanometers. Similarly, if we calculate the different combinations of energy levels corresponding to the other wavelengths, for 486 nanometer, the electron has to transition to n equal to 4 and then relax to n equal to 2. And this energy difference between n equal to 4 and n equal to 2 corresponds to hc by lambda, where lambda is 486 nanometers. For 434 nanometers, we follow the same process, and for this the electron has to transition from n equal to 5 to n equal to 2. And when we follow the same process for 410 nanometers, which is the lowest wavelength, then we obtain that the electron has to get excited to n equal to 6 and then relax to n equal to 2. Just to summarize, in the visible range, the four wavelengths in the line spectrum correspond to these four transitions. And this type of transition where the electrons relax or de-excite from higher levels to n equal to 2 level are called Balmer series. As explained before, these four spectral lines in hydrogen emission spectrum are only present in the visible range, and if electron transition occur between the energy levels with higher energy, then we obtain spectral lines in the UV range. So if we go into the UV range further, more spectral lines are observed at 102 nanometer, 97 nanometer and 94 nanometer, which are very low wavelengths corresponding to high energy. And this corresponds to the transition of electrons from n equal to 2, n equal to 3, n equal to 4, n equal to 5 and n equal to 6 to n equal to 1. Thus, the electronic transitions from different energy levels to the lowest energy level, which is n equal to 1, such kind of series of electronic transitions are called Lyman series. Even though the Bohr's model could explain different electronic transitions for hydrogen atoms and allowed us to calculate the combination of different energy levels between which the electronic transition occurred corresponding to different wavelengths that we have observed in the line spectra of hydrogen emission in UV range as well as in the visible range. However, it is only possible because hydrogen has only one electron and it is a simple system. The Bohr's model couldn't successfully explain the spectrum in the substances with more than one electron like lithium, beryllium, boron or carbon, or even for molecules, which is a limitation. Nevertheless, this gives us a basic understanding of how different electronic transitions between different energy levels correspond to different spectral lines in the line spectrum that is obtained in an emission spectrum of the given substance. We'll discuss the further topics of how the spectrum varies when the molecules are excited and the usage of spectroscopy in different applications in the next lecture. Thank you.